My name is Rex Buchanan. I'm the Director Emeritus of the Kansas Geological Survey. And what follows is a presentation about water issues at Quivira National Wildlife Refuge. This is a talk originally given to the Jayhawk Audubon Club in Lawrence on January 28th, 2019. And the purpose of this talk is really just to talk about some of the background on Quivira itself and some of the current water and legal issues surrounding that. I included this picture of me out in the field because what I want to make it clear that that I don't have background in some areas that folks might expect me to have background in for this talk. That is, my background is not particularly in birding or birds, so even though this is an Audubon talk, I'm not going to talk much about the importance of Quivira as a stop for migratory birds. I operate under the assumption that there are a lot of people out there, many of whom are Audubon members, who know more about that topic than I do. Suffice it to say that I think everyone recognizes the extreme importance of Quivira as a stop on the Central Flyway, and I'm only going to touch on that briefly as I go through this presentation. Also, I want to make it clear that even though I'm going to talk a fair amount about water law here, I don't claim any particular expertise when it comes to the law. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a lawyer. I don't pretend to be. I don't know very much about law in general, but I will say that water law is a critical component of this entire conversation, and thus I will talk about water law somewhat as we go through that. So with those sort of caveats in mind, I want to sort of set the stage to talk about Quivira a little bit. It's a wildlife refuge that is about in the middle of the state. I want to talk a little bit about the water situation in Kansas in general to give some background for where Quivira fits in to the entire state. This map shows a couple of things that are important in this conversation. One is the lines of average annual precipitation, which are those yellow dotted lines, go from north to south across the state. And as you can see, they go from about 20 inches in the west. In some cases, it might be even that there is less than that, say 15 inches per year out in far western Kansas. And then, as virtually everybody in Kansas knows, those numbers get larger as you go from west to east across the state. So average annual precip in the neighborhood of 20 inches a year out west to more than 40 inches a year in eastern Kansas. Now, the area that we're going to be talking about in most of the rest of the talk is in central Kansas in Stafford and Barton counties. They're represented by an SF for Stafford, a BT for Barton counties, right there in central Kansas. And you can see that they're just to the west of that 25-inch line. So average annual precipitation out in that part of the world may be 24 inches per year. And that's important to keep in mind as we go through this conversation. So far less average annual precip than eastern Kansas, but quite a bit more than western Kansas. The other thing this map shows is groundwater availability, and that is somewhat important for the conversation we'll be having through the rest of the talk. The dark blue represent areas that in very general terms you might be able to expect a well drilled into the subsurface to produce roughly on the borderline of 500 gallons of water per minute or more. The green represents areas where you might expect less than 100 gallons per minute. And keep in mind, these are very general depictions of the groundwater situation in Kansas. But the general thing to keep in mind here is that there's a lot more groundwater availability out in western Kansas and in central Kansas than there is in the rest of the state. And that very often in eastern Kansas, that groundwater availability is associated with aquifers that neighbor a river or a stream. We call these alluvial aquifers, and if you look up in northeastern Kansas, you'll see that bright blue that neighbors the Kansas River Valley. That is an alluvial aquifer. This conversation about alluvial aquifers becomes important when we talk about Quivira here in a little bit. So the next slide depicts aquifers in about the western half of Kansas in general. And most people have heard about the one in the western third of the state. That's the Ogallala Aquifer. It underlies not just about the western third of Kansas, but covers about or underlies all of about 8 different states, particularly Colorado, and maybe Nebraska has got the biggest extent of the Ogallala. The Ogallala is composed of sands and gravels that washed off the face of the Rocky Mountains over the last several million years. Within the pore space of those sand and gravels, water is accumulated, and that's the source of the water that people use in western Kansas. When you saw the previous map that showed the bright blue across the western third of the state, that was groundwater that was mainly available from the Ogallala. And the wells out there can produce not just more than 500 gallons of water per minute, but in some cases 1,000 or even more gallons of water per minute. So the Ogallala is that prolific aquifer that just about everybody is familiar with. They're probably somewhat less familiar with an aquifer that is similar. That's the Great Bend Prairie Aquifer. We'll talk more about that in conjunction with Quivira National Wildlife Refuge. But that is an aquifer that is somewhat similar to the Ogallala, roughly similar in age, mostly sands and gravels that make up that aquifer. And then finally, to a little bit to the east of where the Great Bend Prairie Aquifer is the Equus Beds Aquifer. And the Equus Beds, again, somewhat similar to the Ogallala and the Great Bend Prairie aquifers, relatively similar ages, but is to the east. These 3 aquifers make up what, in general terms, people refer to in geology as the Kansas High Plains Aquifer. So the Ogallala, the Great Bend Prairie Aquifer, and the Equus Beds aquifers are all subsets of the High Plains Aquifer. And you'll hear people, particularly in the geology world, use that term High Plains Aquifer. It's not interchangeable with the Ogallala because the Ogallala is only one component of that High Plains Aquifer. So it's important to maintain that differentiation. These 3 aquifers are slightly different in the sense of the Great Bend Prairie Aquifer is shallower, it's closer to the surface, and the soils are out there are relatively sandy, so there's more recharge or natural movement of water back into the Great Bend Prairie Aquifer, and also the Equus Beds Aquifer for that matter, than there is in the Ogallala. The Ogallala, in some cases, may be 300 or 400 feet deep in the subsurface, where the Great Bend Prairie Aquifer is much closer to the surface. Recharge rates in the Ogallala may be certainly less than, maybe on the total of, say, a few inches per year, whereas in the Great Bend Prairie Aquifer, the recharge rates may be 6 inches or even more per year. So these aquifers are somewhat similar geologically, but they also have their differences, and those differences are important when it comes to surface water features like Quivira National Wildlife Refuge. So let's go directly to Quivira. Here's a map that will show you roughly where it is. It's mostly in Stafford County. The map that is up there, you can see the dotted, the kind of dashed line that represents the eastern border of Stafford County. And then Reno and Rice counties are also in there, and you can see very small amounts of wildlife refuge that extend over into those 2 counties. It's very extensive. You can see on the map the Little Salt Marsh on the southern end of the refuge and the Big Salt Marsh more to the north end. You can see it sort of as a series of pools of water. It's not one just big lake or reservoir. It's a series of pools of marshy areas that are connected there that go to create the salt marsh. In particular, I might point out Rattlesnake Creek. There on the bottom of the slide, Rattlesnake Creek is one of the main sources of water that moves into the Little Salt Marsh, and that water is distributed on to the other pools in the salt marsh. We'll talk about Rattlesnake Creek a lot in the course of this conversation. This is just a quick map that shows the surficial geology in that area, and you can see in the blue Little Salt Marsh kind of in the lower right-hand corner of that of the map, Big Salt Marsh in the upper center, and then those browns and yellows represent some of the age of the surficial geology there, and that's mostly relatively recent geology, sands and gravels that are out on the surface. Most of these certainly less than 10 million years old, which geologically is almost like yesterday. If you go out into that area, in addition to the salt marsh, the marshy areas of the refuge, you'll very often see sand dunes, some of them grassed over. And that's a reflection of the surficial geology that's represented in this map. This figure shows more of the subsurface geology, which is very important to that story of the saltiness that makes up in the water in the little salt marsh. The lower figure, again, is just a map that shows in very general terms the superficial geology out there, and you can see Quivira NWR is a Quivira National Wildlife Refuge there in Stafford County, primarily. The notation of the little salt marsh there in that figure. And again, you see Rattlesnake coming in from the southwest. Up above is the subsurface geology. That's a cross-section of what the subsurface would look like if you could go down in subsurface, separate it out, and see it in cross-section. And again, you see the dune sand at the top of that cross-section, and then the Great Bend Prairie Aquifer that we talked about previously, that's the source of much of the water out there. And then underlying that are rocks of Cretaceous age. Cretaceous is a time, we'll call it roughly 80 to 100 million years ago. A shallow ocean covered much of the mid-continent and laid down many rocks that you can still see in other parts of Kansas at the subsurface. The Dakota Formation sandstone that makes up the Smoky Hills in central Kansas, that's Cretaceous age rocks. The chalk beds of far western Kansas, those are rocks deposited during the Cretaceous. Well, that's important to our story here too, because this is sort of an idealized cross-section of the rocks that underlie, these Cretaceous age rocks that underlie Quivira. And probably the primary one that we want to maintain or want to pay attention to there is the Cedar Hills sandstone. The Cedar Hills is a rock unit that does contain saline or salt formations, and water that is salty from the Cedar Hills has moved up into Quivira salt marsh and has created the saltiness in the water there. Now you see at the bottom of that idealized cross-section is the Wellington Formation. Within the Wellington Formation is the Hutchinson Salt Member. The Hutch Salt Member is the layer of rock that people mine in the Hutchinson area in Reno County, in the Lyons area, in Rice County, and in Canopolis up in Ellsworth County. It's a very thick layer of salt, but that's not the salt that is producing the saltiness or the salinity in the water at Quivira Wildlife Refuge. That salt's primarily coming from the Cedar Hills. And all of these rock formations are Permian in age. They're very roughly, you might think of them as roughly the same age as the rocks that crop out at the surface in the Flint Hills. And they are somewhat older than the Cretaceous rocks that I talked about as underlying that entire area previously. So just to give you some idea of the kinds of rocks in the subsurface, and even though you don't see them at the surface at the Wildlife Refuge, they are the source of the salinity. Here's what the Wildlife Refuge looks like from an aerial view. This is a slide that was provided by Bill Johnson in the KU Geography Department. This is particularly a time when there was a fair amount of water out there, and you can see this is relatively shallow water and just very much a marshy area. Now, I do want to make it clear that this area is different from Cheyenne Bottoms. A lot of people who might be interested in this topic are familiar with Cheyenne Bottoms, maybe even more familiar with Cheyenne Bottoms than they are with Quivira. Cheyenne Bottoms is an area to the north that is, on the surface, looks very much like Quivira Wildlife Refuge. In fact, I've gone out there and taken pictures from both of the locations, and when I've come back, sometimes I have trouble telling the two pictures apart. They look, at least at first glance, to be very similar. This is a photo of Cheyenne Bottoms, but probably wouldn't look particularly out of place from Quivira, but they are two very different settings. Cheyenne Bottoms is important as part of the migratory path for birds as well, but they are different in some respects. Here's a map that shows the location of Cheyenne Bottoms. This is in Barton County, again, about in the middle of Kansas. That's Great Bend, the town of Great Bend there, kind of in the lower middle of that. And then you see boxed in blue rectangle there, Cheyenne Bottoms up to the northeast of Great Bend. Now, this is a geologic map of the area, and it's somewhat like the geologic map that I showed you previously of Quivira, except that in addition to these younger sands and gravels, the Quaternary Pleistocene age materials like the sand dunes that I talked about down there at Quivira. In that general vicinity of Cheyenne Bottoms, you'll see some consolidated rocks like those Cretaceous rocks that I mentioned previously, in particular the Dakota Formation sandstone. And you see that kind of a crosshatched or a lined area there. The town of Hoisington is within that. Those are rocks that are part of the Dakota Formation, older consolidated rocks that crop out right at the edge of Cheyenne Bottoms. Keep in mind also some of the drainage that comes into Cheyenne Bottoms as well. We'll talk about that in just a second. Here's a cross-section showing, in very general terms, Cheyenne Bottoms. And again, you see it's underlain by these Cretaceous rocks, or in some cases, the Dakota Formation crops out right along the edge of Cheyenne Bottoms. Also note Walnut Creek that comes in from the west, because Walnut Creek is an important part of this story. The point I want to make with this is the geologic setting in the subsurface for Cheyenne Bottoms is very different than it is for Quivira. Quivira is mostly a superficial feature that is not a depression or a subsidence feature. Cheyenne Bottoms is really a big sinkhole there in central Kansas. Now, the exact source of that subsidence that created Cheyenne Bottoms is not particularly clear, but that depression does express itself down into some underlying rocks. It basically tells us this is a depression in the landscape that's been there for a long, long time. Quivira is not like that. It's not a subsidence feature. There's not an expression of that subsidence down into the deep subsurface. So geologically, the setting for Cheyenne Bottoms is very different than the setting for Quivira, even though they look very similar at the surface, and both of them are fairly reliant on surface water or rivers and streams for the water that comes into them. Let's go back to Quivira. This is what Quivira very often will look like at the surface. Because of the salinity there, you'll see when the water evaporates, you'll see this salty sort of crust on the surface. You don't see that at Cheyenne Bottoms because the water in Cheyenne Bottoms is largely fresh. So let's talk a little bit about the history of Quivira as a wildlife refuge. It was established as part of the National Wildlife Refuge in 1955. Prior to that, it had been owned by a group of private hunting clubs. And back in the late 1800s and then in the 1900s, very often these marshy areas in Kansas, like Cheyenne Bottoms, like Quivira, like an area up in Big Basin in McPherson County, were places that people went out to hunt for particularly ducks and maybe geese. And some of them were market hunters that shot the birds that sold them in markets. Then later on, they're primarily private hunters that wanted access to these places because they did attract wildlife. And so these hunting clubs would often buy up those marshes or the rights to hunt on those marshes. And then in 1955, that acreage, 22,000 acres that makes up Quivira, was bought and made part of the National Wildlife Refuge system, which covers the entire U.S. This is a federal wildlife system, not a state system. It's important to make that differentiation. Quivira is part of a federal system, whereas Cheyenne Bottoms, that we talked about to the north, is part of the state park system. So keep that in mind. In 1957, water rights for Quivira were established that in effect give Quivira the rights to 14,000 acre-feet of water that come into the basin from Rattlesnake Creek. And we talked about Rattlesnake Creek earlier, dumping into a little salt marsh. An acre-foot of water is the amount of water that it takes to cover an acre by 1 foot. It's roughly, we'll call it 325,000 gallons. It's a terminology that's used throughout the water world to talk about an amount of water. So in 1957, the Wildlife Refuge was given the right for a little over 14,000 acre-feet of water to flow into the basin every year. That water right will become an important part of our story later on, but that date, 1957, is very important as well. This shows the movement of that water into Quivira National Wildlife Refuge. Again, if you go down to the lower center part of the slide, you'll see just barely where it says to Hudson. The squiggly line there is Rattlesnake Creek that dumps into a little salt marsh. And then you can see that water is then channeled. And some of these are man-made channels that move the water in various parts of the salt marsh, including up, in some cases, as far north as Big Salt Marsh. And this is a map from the Wildlife Refuge that shows the movement of that water in. Again, you see Rattlesnake Creek on the lower left, and then these various control structures with water moving primarily, I would say, up to the north to a certain extent into the other salt marshes. And then those areas are simply areas of drainage where the water itself where water that falls on the Earth's surface flows into the salt marsh. The reason Rattlesnake Creek is so important goes back to that first map that I showed you of average annual precipitation, this is about in the middle of the state, which means that it gets about 24 inches a year. But that number 24 is only an average. One of the things you learn about water in Kansas is we hardly ever seem to get average annual precip. We almost always get more in a given year or less in a given year. In years when you get more, the marsh is probably fine. But in years when you get less than average precip, then the marsh becomes very reliant on surface water sources like Rattlesnake Creek. And that's an important part of this story. Now we're going to shift into water law, and this is some important concepts to keep in mind as we talk about these issues. First is the statute that says that water is dedicated to the use of the people of the state of Kansas. When you own land in Kansas, you don't automatically own the water that drains through that land or the water beneath that land. Now that's different from, say, oil and gas. When you own a piece of property in Kansas, you generally own the oil and gas resources that are within them. And if you want to allow somebody to drill for oil and gas on your property, you have to sell them the right to do that. Water is different. It's dedicated to the use of the people of the state of Kansas. Therefore, it doesn't belong to individual landowners. But you can get a right to put that water to beneficial use. So if you want to use large amounts of water in Kansas, say for a municipality, a town, or for a factory, or for recreational use, you have to have the right to put that water to a beneficial use. That is, you have to go to the state, you have to say, I want to put that water to a beneficial use, and the state will give you, if they approve it, the right to use that water. You don't have to have a water right for a domestic well for your own house, so that rule doesn't come into play if you're just concerned about that. But if you want to use water for other purposes, put it to a beneficial use, such as a municipality, or in this case, irrigation, you've got to get a right from the state of Kansas. So that's point number one. Point number two is that in Kansas, water laws are based on a doctrine called prior appropriation. Water law in Kansas is almost entirely dictated by the state of Kansas, and that's true for the entire country. That is, the states generally control water law with some exceptions. We'll talk about those in a minute. But states generally control how water is determined, use is determined in a state as opposed to the federal government. Those water laws in each state vary from state to state, but Kansas very much is mostly a Western water law state. In eastern U.S., where water is more plentiful, people use kind of one set of water law. In the western U.S., people tend to use another set of water laws. Kansas tends to use mostly Western water law. And one fundamental precept of Kansas water law is the doctrine of prior appropriation, which basically is commonly expressed as first in time, first in right, which means the oldest water right wins. That is, if you've got a water right, say your water right is from 1957, and somebody else has a water right from 1960, in times when there isn't enough water for everybody, there isn't enough water to go around, if the person using the water from the water right of 1960 is interfering with my right from 1957, I can ask them to stop using water because I have a senior water right. My water is first in time, first in right. The dates of those water rights are very, very important. They're important throughout the state, and particularly important when it comes to this issue of Quivira. In Kansas, water rights are administered by the Division of Water Resources, their department within the Kansas Department of Agriculture. That's a somewhat unusual relationship. I don't think most states do it that way, but water rights in Kansas are determined by the Division of Water Resources. The head person of the Division of Water Resources is referred to as the chief engineer, and that person is the head of the Division of Water Resources. We'll refer to him through the rest of this talk, or that agency is DWR. In addition to the state agency that deals with this, there are groundwater management districts. These are local units of government that were created in the 1970s to try to deal with water issues in the state. Beginning in the 1970s, people realized that there were real problems in the state in terms of water level declines, particularly in that Ogallala Aquifer that we talked about previously. People began to try to worry about how to deal with those declines. There was a sense that in addition to the state agency of DWR, that local people knew how to best deal with those declines, so they created local units of government called groundwater management districts, or GMDs. One of the things you'll learn about in the water world is that people in the water world, they love acronyms and abbreviations. So since this talk is about the water world, we're going to talk about acronyms and abbreviations. We're going to use them, and GMDs are simply an abbreviation for groundwater management districts. Now, I said before, most of the laws that affect water use in Kansas are state laws, but federal laws come into play in this conversation about Quivira as well, and they come into play because Quivira is a national wildlife refuge. So for the most part, state water use, the legality is determined by the state, but in this case, federal law comes into play as well. And here are some areas that it does. There's a bill, there was a congressional act called the National Wildlife Refuge System Improvement Act that requires full ecological sustainability for wildlife refuges. And this act, in effect, says that the wildlife refuge can't agree to anything that will lead to a reduction of flow of water into the wildlife refuge. It's important to know that these federal laws, by my understanding, supersede state laws. So the state cannot do anything that violates federal acts like this one. Another federal law that comes into play here is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act that prevents any kind of a settlement that might affect migratory birds, particularly those birds that come in, many of which come into Quivira. The Endangered Species Act, that most people are familiar with, comes into play as well, and it comes into play, and we'll mention why here in a second. And then there are a variety of other federal laws and administrative acts that influence how Quivira can behave as a wildlife refuge when it comes to water issues as well. Most people probably that know Quivira know it for this, which is whooping cranes that come through and very often will spend some time at Quivira in the course of their migration. They are part of that, one of those endangered species that's affected by federal law. So those are all ways that the federal law affects Quivira. Well, let's go back to the state. Let's go back to groundwater management districts, because the GMDs will come into play as part of this story as well. This is a map of groundwater management districts in the state. There are 5 of them. 3 of them out west cover the western third of the state. They mostly deal with Ogallala issues. The blue, the green, and I guess it's kind of a brownish one. In central Kansas, those are the 3 out west. But a plain brown one that covers the central part of the state that is the one that covers the part of the story we're concerned about. And again, if you look at SF or Stafford County, you'll see that it's covered entirely by the Big Bend Groundwater Management District number 5. And that's basically a group of people that come together to try to deal with water issues on a local basis instead of entirely dealing with them from the state basis. Then finally, you also see the red Equisbeds GMD a little bit to the east of there. Before we move on, I'm going to call your attention to a light yellow block of territory up in northwestern Kansas. That is a LEMA, a locally enhanced management area. Don't worry about that abbreviation for right now. We'll come back to it in a minute, but I want you to notice where it is up there in Sheridan, mostly in Sheridan County, also somewhat in Thomas County in northwestern Kansas. Remember where that is. We'll come back to that one in a minute. So Groundwater Management District number 5, Big Bend District, you can see it depicted here, runs mostly from Kiowa County down in southwestern Kansas on up into Rice County up in central Kansas. And the brown on this figure is the GMD. The yellow within the figure is the area that's drained by Rattlesnake Creek, and we talked about it before. Now, these are the points of diversion within the Rattlesnake Creek watershed. And a point of diversion is basically where somebody has gotten a water right to move water from the subsurface, or in some cases the surface, and put it to beneficial use. And these are, in effect, the points of diversion or water rights that people have there along the drainage area of Rattlesnake Creek that drains up toward Quivira. Now, you can see there are quite a few of them, and there are a total of roughly 1,600 water rights in that drainage basin within Quivira. Now, one of the things that's very important to keep in mind here is that most of those water rights are younger than the water right that the Quivira Wildlife Refuge has that goes into Quivira. I said before, that water right dates to 1957, and roughly in the ballpark of 95% of these water rights are younger than Quivira. That is, Quivira water right is older and more senior than most of these most recent water rights. Therefore, if for whatever reason Rattlesnake Creek can't deliver that 4,400 acre-feet of water into Quivira, as Quivira is legally entitled to, Quivira is more senior to the big bulk of these other water rights and has the right, Quivira therefore has the right to say, we need the people with those younger water rights to reduce their water use so water flows into Quivira. And that's really the crux of the question. In a number of years, over the past few years, there have been times when that 4,400 acre-feet has not come into Quivira because it's been so dry and because of these younger water rights. And the result then has been Quivira has not gotten its appropriation of water that it has the right to be delivered. And it's been the result of concern about these younger water rights that are out there in the state. At this point, we can talk a little bit about possible responses to the lack of water that's going into Quivira. This is some of the range of them, from a LEMA to an intensive groundwater control use area to in-gun removal, augmentation, and legal action. And we'll talk about each of these one by one. The first one to talk about is a LEMA. That's a local enhanced management area, a voluntary approach that folks in a given area can come together and decide that they want to limit their irrigation by a certain amount. The one LEMA that currently exists in Kansas is the area shown in yellow up in northwestern Kansas in Sheridan. It's generally referred to as Sheridan 6. Landowners there came together and decided to, over a 5-year period, voluntarily all cut back by 20%, and have done that for 5 years, have renewed it for another 5 years, and generally, I think, have found that they've been able to cut back on that amount of water use without a huge economic impact or maybe any economic impact on production. Other LEMAs have been proposed, including one for all of Groundwater Management District in northwestern Kansas, that area shown in blue, but that one's currently under some legal challenges. And there's been also a proposal for a LEMA in other places, but particularly in the Big Bend District as one approach, a sort of a local grassroots kind of approach as a way to deal with this issue. One other possibility that people have mentioned over time is an intensive groundwater use control area, or an IGUCA. Those are more top-down driven approaches in which the chief engineer of the Division of Water Resources establishes restrictions on water use, sometimes across the board. It could be sort of also some more senior rights are affected less than junior rights. There are currently IGUCAs in several places shown on this map in Kansas, but there hasn't been an IGUCA created for some time. It was an approach that was used at Cheyenne Bottoms in that Walnut IGUCA that shows up here on this map, particularly there in Barton County. And again, one has been proposed for Big Bend, but by and large, folks seem to probably favor the Lima approach as opposed to the Iguca approach, just because of the voluntary grassroots nature of a Lima. This map shows some of the areas that people have proposed for applying some of the restrictions that they talk about. The proposed Lima boundary is shown on this map of the Big Bend district, and you can see how much ground that covers, and also another area where it's been proposed for a 4,000 acre-feet a year curtailment. One of the other proposals here was the in-gun removal. In-guns are simply features on the end of center pivot system that squirt water out over the end of the center pivot system and attempt to sort of get in the corners of fields that otherwise wouldn't receive water because of the circular nature of center pivot systems. Those are generally considered not particularly effective in terms of a lot of water evaporates when you use those end guns. A proposal of removal of those is part of a proposal for a way to meet the needs for additional water into Quivira. And then finally, one other idea that's proposed is augmentation. And augmentation is simply drilling of wells in a certain area, pumping water out of those areas into in this case, Quivira. If you look at this map, you see an area that's mostly in kind of a pinkish red color. It says -5 feet, with a brownish area around it says -2 feet over there in east central part of the slide. Basically, there's a proposal for the drilling of a series of wells, moving water from the subsurface in that area, putting it into Quivira as a way to make up for the water that's not being delivered down Rattlesnake Creek. Augmentation creates its own set of issues. One of the issues is out here is water quality, and we'll talk about that in a second. There is some resistance to augmentation because it's simply moving water from one part of the district to another, but augmentation's not unheard of in Kansas. We'll talk about that in a second. This is a slide from the Kansas Geological Survey that shows how much pumping in the area in general would have to be reduced in order to basically stabilize the water levels. And under normal climatic conditions, you can see that it would have to be about an 8.2% reduction in order for water levels to come back up. In order for more water to go into Quivira, that number would have to be even higher. So basically some sense of the kind of reductions that would be needed, not maybe catastrophic reductions, but certainly significant reductions, particularly in the minds of landowners out there. Now, to go back to augmentation, augmentation is a technique that has been tried in other parts of the country and used in other parts of the country, and has been used in Kansas. This is an augmentation program down in the Equus beds down by Wichita. It's a project that takes water out of the Little Arkansas River or in wells adjacent to the Little Arkansas. As you can see here on the slide, the Little Arkansas running through Halstead, then a well field with those orange dots alongside there. Water taken out of those alluvial wells during times of high flow or flood events, treated and put into the Equus beds. And the idea has been basically take water that otherwise would be move on down the river during flood events, put it into the Equus beds to stabilize or raise water levels for water for eventual use in a well field for the city of Wichita. It's a project that's been going on for some time. So augmentation isn't unheard of. The difference here is that augmentation in the project and predominantly in Stafford, Pratt, and counties is an issue of water quality. The aquifer there is relatively shallow. As you go deeper in the aquifer, the water quality tends to be a little lower in terms of salinity, and this map shows chloride concentrations in that area. And concerns are that if you pump water from the top of the aquifer where it's fairly fresh and you pump it fairly heavily, you might draw up saline water that's underneath it and might produce salinity to the point that it would not be acceptable water to move into Rattlesnake Creek and Quivira. So there are questions about augmentation as a strategy here as well, and most of those questions are related to salinity in that area, and that's what these maps show if you're interested in more information about that. There are a couple of other players in this process. One is the Water PAC, the Water Protection Association of Central Kansas. It's a group primarily of private landowners, agricultural producers and irrigators who have come together to work on these issues and raise questions and answer questions about water use out there. Then finally, a group of predominantly public and private entities that have come together to work on restoring stream flow in parts of the Arkansas River, primarily through the removal of vegetation in some parts of that to try to help with groundwater depletion. The reason that this is really a broader issue, and I think one that's of interest to me, is because it is part of a larger issue that's gone on in Kansas in terms of stream flow depletion. This map here, these maps, the first map shows perennial stream flow in 1961, basically flow in the state where rivers flow perennially or all the time. And you can see by 1994 how much that perennial flow has been reduced. You know, the area that most people are familiar with is the Arkansas River, which basically no longer flows from about Garden City to Great Bend. But you can see also there's been a pretty dramatic reduction in flow in the Smoky Hill River and many of those tributaries in northwestern Kansas. Some of that may be due to conservation techniques like terraces, which I think most people would agree are desirable techniques. But a lot of it is due to the pumping of wells that are adjacent to streams, wells that pump out of those alluvial aquifers. Those aquifers provide stream flow during times of low precipitation, and then water during times of high precipitation flows back into those alluvial aquifers. But when you lower those through the heavy pumping of alluvial wells, in effect, you're removing stream flow. And so that's probably been the primary source of this reduced stream flow from 61 to 94. And then here's the most recent map. And the dotted lines, or dashed lines here, show where there is no longer perennial flow, again, primarily because of that pumping. And you can see not just the Arkansas and some of those northwestern Kansas tribs that have been reduced in stream flow, but again, Rattlesnake Creek, the tributary into Quivira that we're talking about, that doesn't flow perennially in a variety of areas because of that reduced stream flow. So that concern about the lack of water in perennial streams is not just an issue here in Quivira. It's an issue throughout western Kansas, probably most notably in the Arkansas River, one of the biggest rivers in Kansas that in effect is dry through much of its course in western Kansas. So in some respects, Quivira is just one part of a bigger issue. And I think trying to figure out how to address Quivira maybe leads into that conversation about the importance of stream flow in the state in general and how to address those issues. So closing finally, in order to try to raise awareness about issues related to Quivira and also just to help people appreciate Quivira, Audubon of Kansas did a crane celebration in 2018. I think it was pretty successful. So Audubon of Kansas is coming back with a second go-round this year, November 1st through the 3rd of 2019. Predominantly on that Saturday of that weekend, folks from AOK will be out there helping lead tours, give talks. Hopefully the weather and the birds will cooperate and people can learn more about the importance of Quivira in terms of waterfowl migration, but also the water issues surrounding it that we've talked about a little bit in this slideshow. So with that, I appreciate the chance to talk about this issue that I think is of importance to the state, and glad to do what we can to raise awareness about it. Thank you.